Good evening, everyone. Welcome back to your weekly dose of educational horror. This is the Dark R Podcast, and I'm your host, KDG, the last living persona from the Great Split Personality War of 2019. Before we start, I'd like to point out that this podcast is a work of fiction. Any resemblance to any existing person, living or dead, is purely coincidental. The aim of this podcast is to entertain and nothing else. So let's get to it. Ever watched a horror movie and found a character who seems to know what the hell is happening? The nerd who reads about folklore and tells the main characters what they need to do? Well, over the years, people around me have constantly told me that I was that guy. Fortunately, we don't live in a horror movie, but all the same, I'd like to help my listeners out just in case they do manage to encounter the unexplained. For tonight's episode, we'll be talking about your standard paranoia come true, hauntings. What is considered a haunting? What are the basic types? What should you expect? And what can you do to prevent, if not escape, a haunting? By the end of this episode, you should be able to tell if your house is haunted, what's haunting it, and what you need to do to survive. So sit back, relax, and enjoy as we tackle all the things that go bump in the night. Picture this. It's nighttime. You're in your room, and you're getting ready for bed. The door's closed, and you turn off the light before climbing into bed. Before you close your eyes, you take one last faint look around your room. The lights are off, the AC is on, but you notice the door is open. You sit up and wonder if you closed it properly. You shrug it off and get out of bed to close it again. For sure this time. When you turn your back to it though, you hear it again. The slow creak of the opening door. You look and confirm that the door is really open. You stand there puzzled, having no idea why the door can't seem to close. You check the knob, the latch, every part of the door. Everything looks okay. You open and close it a few times to check if it's closing properly, and it does. So you close the door and hold it firm. It stays closed. You're starting to get paranoid, so you lock it for good measure. You go back to the bed and close your eyes. You start drifting off, but then you hear a sharp knock on the door. You open your eyes and stare at it. You're alone in the house, but the knock continues. You gather your courage and jump out of bed. You wait for it. You're waiting for the knock. As soon as it comes, you swing open the door, but no one's there. You're tired, and you figured it's just your mind playing tricks on you. You close the door one last time. You lock the door and make sure nothing comes in while you sleep. You go back to bed, and as you're laying down, you stare at the door again. You wait for the knock. Is it coming? A minute passes. 2, 3, 5 minutes pass. You breathe a sigh of relief and close your eyes. But then you hear it. Good night. So, what you just experienced is a haunting, or rather, what we simulated. A haunting is when an entity stays or passes through a certain area. It's mostly associated to areas that are usually very old or where someone died very suddenly. To call back to our previous episode, when a white lady is seen in a certain area, it is the very basic example of a haunting. There are many reasons that supposedly cause this phenomenon, and the main one being a person dying suddenly. It's said that the spirit of the person is unaware of its untimely death, so it kind of lingers around the site where it died. Some say it's a spirit that has unfinished business, wherein the entity haunting the location was unable to do something important before it died. In any case, basically, a haunting can result in a plethora of activity that can range from sightings or manifestations, movement of items or furniture, communication between the living and the dead, and the worst of it, possessions. So it will really depend on what kind of haunting is currently happening within the area. So that begs the question, how can you tell? Well, let's cover the basics, shall we? We'll consider your room. For the next few minutes, we'll be subjecting it to multiple haunting scenarios. The first one is something that can be subtle. You hear a faint voice or two, you hear random sounds that can't be explained in your room, like shouting, or those ghostly cries of pain or moaning that you hear in the movies. Not that kind of moaning, and not that kind of movie. But what you're currently experiencing is a residual haunting. Residual haunting usually occurs in areas of great significance. This could be an area where a former person spent their time a lot, or an area bombarded with energy. It can either be positive energy, wherein, well, think parties that constantly happen there, or a place of gathering, perhaps, like a general plaza, or a gymnasium, perhaps, of an old school. But it can also be negative, where a violent death happened or an accident. We call it residual because it's like a snapshot of the past. The things you're hearing are embedded in the area and are basically playing out on a loop. It's subtle because it's very rare to see anything and mostly you just hear things. It's also notable because when residual hauntings happen, it's usually at a certain time, usually when the certain incident happened. Say there was a gruesome shootout in the area that led to deaths at around 3 in the afternoon. If you stay there at around 3 in the afternoon, you may hear subtle hints of gunshots at around that time as well. It's a very polite and scheduled haunting, is what I'm saying. Even if you did manage to see or hear one, it will play out the same way every time because, like I said, these are just snapshots or GIFs of the past playing itself out. It doesn't know you're there, nor will it acknowledge you. A famous example of this is the Boleyn haunting in England, where she was sighted riding a horse-drawn carriage drawn by a headless horseman towards Blickling Hall. She was famously ordered to be beheaded by King Henry VIII, and this particular haunting happens on her death anniversary, which is the 19th of May. And yes, her, the driver, and the 4 horses, all headless. So let's go back to your room. We'll take it up a notch and say there are manifestations happening around. You can see an apparition just hanging around too. You can try to ignore it, but you know it's there, and when you look, it's staring straight back at you. Sometimes it calls to you, it knows your name, it knows what you're doing, and basically think of it like a very creepy roommate that you see every now and then. What you're experiencing there is now called an intelligent or high activity haunting. This is what you see in ghost hunting shows, basically. Shout out to Ghost Adventures, by the way. This was the show that I consumed back in the day. Quick sidebar, by the way. I wanted to be a paranormal investigator back in around college, right around the time I was hosting the original Dark Hour. I did my research on demonology at the time mostly. I was actually a biology major turned engineering major, but nearly all of my time was spent researching about the occult. I have no idea how I managed to pass. Anyway, in high activity hauntings, the area becomes a hotspot for spiritual entities. This is your basic haunted house situation. An entity can interact with you directly, it can show you what it looks like, and it can even talk to you. This isn't all too bad though, as it can be a haunting of someone you know who passed away, or someone who previously lived in your house who just can't move on. Oof, I can relate to that one. But a notable example of this is the White Lady of the Baleta Drive. It still flags down taxis, so you know it's interacting with the taxi drivers. It can talk, and you can basically see it pass through the road. So that's your basic high activity haunting. For the third type of haunting, and I argue the most famous one because of a certain movie, things can start moving around the room. You see the curtains sway a bit, the doors keep opening and closing, the chair moves a couple of feet from you, even though there's no wind, and come on, it's a chair. Eventually it gets violent. The cabinets open up all at the same time, the door slams itself even when there's no one near it, your phone yeets itself across the room for no reason. What you're experiencing now is a poltergeist. A poltergeist is an entity that can physically move your stuff around with varying degrees of force. It could be a gentle push or a very aggressive one. This is the haunting that denotes malevolence, as it wants to cause harm to the hauntee, i.e. you. It still follows the same scenarios of previous hauntings in the sense that the location may be of significant importance to the entity, or it can just be an act of vengeance from a very hateful entity. Probably what I'll turn into when I pass on, really. In any case, famous examples of this is the Enfield Poltergeist, which was heavily covered and criticized by the media at the time. If you're not familiar, it's made even more famous by its adaptation in The Conjuring, namely Conjuring 2. Of course, minus Valak the Nun or Bill Wilkins. Man, I love that character though. Freaked me out the most out of all the Conjuring-verse entities. Just the girl sitting there being possessed by Bill Wilkins and his chair. Whew! Creeps me out. And the girl dying in that chair eventually when she got old. Come on. Anyway, our final type of haunting is arguably the worst kind, you might say, because this time we're not even in your room. It can happen basically anywhere. Think about all the things we've been through in your room. The voices, the apparitions, visions, the stuff moving around. The entity haunting you not only knows your name, it knows your deepest, darkest secrets, and it actually uses it to torture you. It follows you around, making you constantly weak and nauseated, until ultimately it takes control. That's right, baby. We're talking about demonic possession. To be clear, the entity we're dealing with now is no longer human. It is an entity of pure evil who wants nothing more than to make you suffer. All of the hauntings combined, it can do to weaken you mentally and spiritually. Once it weakens you long enough, it can start taking over your body. And unlike the movies, it's not all head spinning or spider walking nonsense, even though that's the creepiest thing I've ever seen. It can be as subtle as a mood shifting constantly, being more vulnerable to suggestions from the demon itself, not to others, and ultimately ending up in a full possession, which we will be discussing in a different episode. Anyway, in this particular haunting, it's not really limited to the area, rather the person who the demon latches onto. Doesn't matter if you stay in the house, go to a hotel, or be at grandma's house for all I care, it will follow you there. There can be a number of reasons why, but the end game is still the same. It wants to take the soul of the haunted, and if the possession is proven true, there are only two ways of getting rid of it: an exorcism or death. It's that simple. So now we go to how to deal with it in our horror movie scenario. How do we get rid of the hauntings? Well, first and foremost, research is to be done here. Who or what is exactly haunting you? What kind of haunting are you dealing with? Where exactly is the ground zero for all the activities? At this point, you can probably answer all these questions based on what we've discussed so far. If you're not able to do this and you just suspect that your house is being haunted, there can be many signs as well. Hauntings feed off energy, which causes the infamous flickering lights, lowered batteries for devices, or they just generally stop working, lowered temperatures for sure. We're not talking about just cold spots, we're talking about cold to the point of freezing. Depends really on how strong the entity is within the area. And generally, even the demeanor of everyone within the location. Depending on the haunting, an entity feeds off the energy and emotions of the people around it. It's said that the more negative the emotions, the more likely that the area is vulnerable for a haunting. But what if you're already in the thick of it? Say there's activity every single night and you're at your wit's end. What then? Well, I'd consider getting a blessing in the area if you're the religious type. You can get a blessing from a priest or your local parish. I'm not quite sure because I'm not really that religious. But you can also try the old-timey methods like sprinkling salt under the door, as this is said to ward off entities back in the day. You can see this in the apothecaries and everything. You can also consult your local albularyo for any kind of talisman or wards that they can recommend. If all else fails, however, well, you can just always move. What are you gonna prioritize? The house that is already haunted, by the way, or yourself? You have to prioritize your safety. But if this is not an option, I'd go the old school route and just treat the entity, so long as it's not malevolent, with the respect it deserves, and it should leave you alone. Some even go so far as to offer some food to appease these entities, because generally they're just there. It's not as if they want to be there. Sometimes they have no choice. But if you really want the simplest way of doing things, take a page out of your generic psychic friend and just ignore it. Chances are you get used to it and it just becomes a nuisance. After a while, you barely notice it happen, or you just get annoyed with it a little bit. But all in all, with that, I can say congratulations. You just survived your horror movie scenario. Except for exorcisms, because we'll be dealing with that in another episode. And that is a wrap on today's episode. I hope you guys enjoyed our topic. This will be the 5th episode of the Dark Hour podcast, so I'll start uploading these to Spotify, iTunes, what have you. But I'm still working out the logistics for it. But if I do manage to get it out in time, I'll definitely add the link down in the description below. I'm still uploading gaming videos on Wednesdays and Dark Hour podcast episodes on Sundays. So if you like the content and you want to see more, you can check out the channel for previous episodes. And for my gaming shenanigans, I made a playlist for everything to make it easy for everyone. You can use the gaming videos as a palate cleanser if you want. But then again, this has been the Dark Hour podcast, and I am your host, KDG, saying good fright and good night.